So it's a good thing that you already told me what you want me to focus on, Z, just because that gives me an idea on what I should be addressing in this feedback. And I think one of the key things when giving feedback is trying to figure out what the person you're giving feedback to actually wants to improve on. Because, for example, I might go into a whole rant about, let's just say, lighting here, whereas maybe that's not something that necessarily Zyalin is focusing on, because this piece has the purpose of just practicing character design and creating cool shapes. And of course, there's always things that we can always improve on with every single aspect of our art. But generally, I tend to find that it's best to address the most pressing need. The best way you can find that out is to actually ask the person that you're giving feedback on, what is it that they really want to focus on. And hello, Cactus. Great to see you. How are you doing? And thank you for the resub, Hiro. Really appreciate it. You broke the streak, but that's fine. Don't worry about it. Really appreciate that, man. Well, hopefully you feel better soon, Talks. Alright, so as Zyalin said, we'll be focusing on shape design for this one. So overall, I think it's looking cool. I think the character in itself, I like the shapes. I tend to be a little bit of a sucker for rounded characters, big chunky characters, and this definitely ticks all the boxes of that. However, one of the things that I already immediately see with this design is that there's quite an even split. Wait, let me actually just save this quickly. Zyalin paint over. So one of the things that I already see is that there's an even split in terms of the proportion. So if we divide the whole character's height into two, you'll notice that the top part is actually quite even with the bottom part. I mean, maybe it's slightly different, but to me, I really think we can push it a lot more, especially for a character that is a lot more stylized. Oh, I'll just catch up in the chat with a bit, guys. Oh, cool. Fantastic. Alright, fantastic. I think that works now. Alright, I'll just address the feedback one by one, guys. So I'll just focus on Zyalin's first. So as I was mentioning, when it comes to shape design, I think one principle is really important to keep in mind. And it's the idea of... Actually, you know what? Let me write that down with a less angry looking color. So this is the general principle that I abide by. Breaking evens. So the idea is that you want to create a symmetry in terms of a lot of different things. In terms of width, length, and height, you want to avoid 50-50, where it's an even split. You want to create an asymmetry. Sometimes you might have even heard of like the 70-30 rule, or the 80-20 rule and variants of that. And why those tend to work is that there's an uneven split. So in this case, one thing that I would start off immediately is just by, let's just say this character is going to be very much bottom heavy. I personally would take something like this and shrink it either all the way down or all the way up. It really depends what kind of feel that you're going for. When you're making the top a lot smaller, one thing you're doing is making the character feel like he's very stable. So this gives him an almost overall triangular silhouette. Whereas before, I would say that it's a little bit more closer to a rectangle. So it's quite a boring one. And not to say you can't do square silhouettes, but I feel like with the flow of a lot of these lines, it tends to lend itself better to a little bit more of a triangular shape. So one of the things that you can also do, of course, is make the top a lot bigger. However, that gives a completely different feeling. Like now the character feels like it's a lot more hulking. So it really depends on what you're going for. Is there a particular vision you had for this character, Zyalin, or a preference? Would you prefer him to be more top heavy or a little bit more bottom heavy? I would say bottom heavy, yeah. Alright, fantastic. So let's go with that then. So that's what I would first of all focus on. So I'll just paint this out. And another thing as well when it comes to shape design that you probably think about is that we want to focus on... actually, you know what? Let's focus on the same aspect first. But another one that I would like to cover after this is silhouette clarity, but we will get to that. Let's not jump all over the place. Because a good shape design, no matter how good your proportion is, if all of the limbs are kind of hidden within the silhouette, it will make a very powerful statement. So let's just focus on maybe the shape design first. So after shrinking things down, you'll notice that despite the fact that the proportions are less even now, you can start looking at some of the smaller segments within the piece. So now you can start looking at, for example, maybe the lengths between each of the limbs. Are they the same, or are they different enough? So in this case, I actually think that the height here, for example, is quite similar to the height here. So it feels like I personally would do something to create an even further distinction. It feels like the limbs here and even this body all kind of feels like it has the same length. So one of the things that I would try to do is maybe introduce a little bit more of a negative space in between here. So now we have a much clearer distinction between the height of this and the height of that lower part of the body as well. And hello Jasmine, great to see you on the stream. How are you doing? So personally, I would even try to introduce some negative shapes a little bit more here as well. Just to let it breathe a little bit better and create a further distinction even. And when you're doing that as well, you are also addressing this issue here. So I feel like I can't help myself but actually try and kill two birds with one stone here. So I'm trying to create a little bit more breathing room over here to break the evenness in terms of like the size of things. But as a result, that also makes the silhouette a lot clearer as well. So I think that's one thing that you guys can do in general to make your designs read clearer is just add in more negative shapes. Like I really love these small negative shapes that you've done here, Z. And I feel like you could push that a little bit more here too. So maybe I'll take the limbs and actually just flare it out a little bit more. Just so we have a little bit of this space between the body and the elbow. And as a personal preference, I would like to have him have a really huge belly too. It seems like he's one of those characters that maybe because he's been relying so much on his body, or more like robotic legs, he's kind of forgotten how to walk, you know, and he's grown quite a huge belly from that. So that's what I'm imagining. So I'm also trying to think about the personality of the character as well, and a little bit of like maybe the backstory too. So one of the things as well is that I feel that maybe we could do is even make the silhouette of the head a little bit clearer. I realize that you're trying to do something a little bit more subdued, but somehow I feel like there's some really interesting potential here that can be done even with the head or even the headdress here. So for example, this silhouette is quite flat here, with the exception of, you know, maybe a few of these little hints at the top, but I feel we can definitely make it a lot more interesting, you know. So maybe, for example, like this shape, you can kind of have it flare out and do a little bit of a silhouette break here. And one of the things that I'm noticing as I'm doing this, it almost looks as if his collar is popping, almost like an emperor wearing a really huge robe. And hey, Adu, great to see you. How are you doing? So find any reason that you guys can in order to pop the silhouette and make it much more interesting. And sometimes by doing so, you can even find interesting justifications for it. In this case, I'm noticing that it almost makes him look a lot more like an emperor in his robes, for example. And you can do the same as well here, for example. So that rather than just having an extremely simple silhouette over here, now we have something a lot more interesting. And then of course, by doing that, you can try and echo those shapes here as well. And this is another thing about shape design, is that you want to try to have consistent design language. So if you've used this kind of shape, for example, on the shoulders, maybe you can even repeat it down on the legs here. Then maybe even stretch it out a bit. Just try and move it around, see what you can get. And of course, sometimes you might need to do a little bit of an adjustment. But I think it'll be really cool for you to just echo some of those shapes as well down here. And because you're repeating some of the shapes, it already immediately makes it feel a lot more consistent. So maybe this is a little bit too big, so maybe I'll just shrink it down as well. Feels like it's a little bit too much. Awesome, I'm happy to hear that you're getting something out of it. And then you'll notice as well, like with the flow of things, you'll notice that with the shoulder pads, it kind of doing that little swoopy thing, and you can echo it here, and then even further down here as well. So this might not address the silhouette, but this addresses the issue of design language consistency. So here I'm also gonna grab the arm and try and make it, the silhouette, a lot more clear too. For example, like so. You'll notice that just by doing that, you can see the intentions of the character much clearer. So before and after so far. So I'll just turn off the notes. So before and after. And of course, one last thing as well that I think would be worth trying to do is, usually if you want to create a very strong focal point for a certain design, you can do it in a bunch of different ways, you know, but in essence what you're trying to do is introduce contrast. So for example, maybe in this case, in order to make the silhouette stand out a lot more, you can have some smaller shapes near the top. Because one thing that you'll notice if you're actually looking at this character, you have these big shapes over here, but as it goes towards the focal point, you'll notice that it gets increasingly smaller. You'll notice by the time you reach the face, you have these tiny shapes such as the teeth and the eyes. And of course, in terms of the arms as well. So what does that actually mean? When you reach the focal point, it means that you generally want to make it a lot more different than any other part. So Zyalin, you did a great job here in terms of controlling it with detail density. But one of the other things that you can do is, of course, maybe introduce a lot more smaller shapes that pop out of the silhouette. So maybe, let's just say you can have some cables maybe coming out of the character. And you'll notice with the negative shapes as well that's being introduced. So it's not just with positive shapes, guys. So this is a positive, this is a negative shape, and you can say that this is a positive shape. So positive shape is, this is a negative shape. I guess this doesn't count since it's a shadow. A positive shape is essentially, like the big shapes, and the negative shapes are the ones that you're kind of carving into those bigger shapes in order to create a little bit of space. So you'll notice here, there's some space, some here as well, some here, some here, and even the gap between an arm is in the negative space as well. So here, you'll notice what I'm doing is that I'm introducing a greater density as well of negative shapes near the top. So that could be one of the ways, for example, you can introduce contrast and make your focal point a lot stronger. And of course, you can simplify all of the others, because if everything has a lot of dense negative shapes, then nothing does, right? So yeah, I also just tone this down just so it doesn't stand out as much. Oop, let me do it this way. There we go. And yeah, of course, then you can start adding in small details as well. Then you can add in the shadows, the darker shadows, that is. But yeah, this is my thought process, at least dealing with the shape design aspect of things. So just to recap, it's breaking evenness. So this is how it was before. So the proportions overall were very even. So I decided to shrink down the top part in order to make the top part proportion smaller than the bottom part. And also on top of that as well, I decided to clarify the silhouette by introducing more negative shapes, which clarifies the gesture and the pose a lot more. But also by adding negative shapes, it just creates some interest in the silhouette. And the last part is that as you are defining the silhouette, you'll notice that by adding these shoulder pads, that I decided to replicate it throughout the character design as well, in order to make it much more consistent throughout. So that was a bit of a domino effect there. But yeah, of course, there's other ways we can make the design pop more as well. So we can always talk about colors, but that might be another topic for another paint over. So for example, that could be it. But I'll just leave it like this. So what would you like to focus on for the feedback, Synner? Oh, okay, mostly lighting and perspective. Cool. All right, awesome. So I'll just bring it up on stream and I'll restretch the timer. All right, cool. I'll do that as well. I don't know if some people might be a little bit, I guess, private. There you go. And hey, Fer, great to see you, man. How are you doing? Alright, so Synner said he would like to focus on lighting and perspective. All right, cool. So this is a traditional piece, so maybe I'll have to approach it a bit differently. But first of all, I think it's looking really cool. I think the mood is great, and I think that the traditional feel really gives it its own charm, you know. Despite the fact that maybe the lighting is not necessarily the most accurate, I actually like the fact that it does feel like a postcard, you know, or something that, yeah, it just feels like something maybe for a magazine illustration. So I think it has its own distinct style. However, if we just want to look at it just from the lens of perspective and lighting, we can do that. So first of all, I think in terms of perspective, it's quite solid. So first of all, I think it'll be good to just introduce a white layer on top of it. And what I'm gonna do is just use the perspective tool. So what I'm seeing here immediately is that there's a bit of wonkiness happening here with the windows. I don't know if you guys in the chat can notice that as well too. And first says currently working, so I'm gonna be looking for a most part. Hey, no worries, man. No worries. You can always take part in future ones too. Alright, so one of the things I'm immediately noticing is that, well, I think for the most part, you did a good job with the perspective here. It lines up with the grid very well. And the horizon line seems to be about here, I believe. However, one of the things that I'm immediately noticing is that this street seems to converge very weirdly. I realized that this building from the top probably looks something a little bit more like this. So I understand it can be a little bit more tricky in terms of having multiple vanishing points for this. However, I feel like this street immediately sticks out to me. So even if, let's just say it has a different vanishing point, you'll notice that your road is kind of, if I draw lines on the cobblestone, it's not converging towards any vanishing points right now. It's just flat. And I think it's really affecting the read of your piece. And on top of that as well, like with the window, this line is curving up. And unless your window frame actually curves up, it wouldn't do that. It would essentially do something like this. It would actually curve a little bit more inwards. So if you're actually doing a window like this, what I would recommend is, for example, just plot out the part before the curve actually starts. So something here. And then after that, you figure out your secondary vanishing point. This is your first one, but let's just say it goes somewhere here. Wait, let me actually simplify this a little bit. It's getting a little bit complicated. So let's just say this is where the curve begins, but everything else before that is a bit more straight. If you're looking at it from the top, it'll look something like this. And what I'm essentially trying to do is create a point where the curve is at its peak, and I'm going to connect it like this. So I'll have to find out the middle here. So in order to find out the center of a line, I have to create a cross, or like so. And where the two diagonals intersect, I'll just draw along the perspective, and I'll find out that it's around here, or maybe a bit further out, maybe around here, and then I'll curve it like so. And then after that, I can just pull it up, and I'll repeat the same thing as it goes up pretty much. And you'll notice that here it would look a little bit more like this, because the other point would be around here. So it will curve around something like that. So that's how I would generally deal with curved windows in general. So that is the underdrawing. And what I'm gonna do is now implement it into the piece itself. So the curve would probably look something more like this, Synner. So as you can see, even with the top as well, I probably change it up a bit. So here I'm gonna make it also conform to perspective a little bit more too. So now I'm gonna turn off the perspective grid. So that's how the window should look like a lot more. And on the note with the street as well, it'll probably look something a little bit more like this. So once again, if I bring this perspective grid up, it'll look something more like this. Make sure it converges back to your vanishing point. And of course, even for the car as well. Maybe I'll make it stick out a little bit more. Maybe I would actually pull the vanishing point further out actually. But something like that. I think there's something definitely a bit trickier about doing these kinds of buildings that don't conform necessarily to a cube. Yeah, maybe I think I would have pulled it out a little bit more. But I think now the issue here is that the car now is a little bit too small, despite the fact that it might actually sit in perspective better. So then I probably resize it a little bit too. So something more like that. I think that's why I was looking a little bit funky. It would probably be a lot bigger too. And maybe with the perspective, it's a little bit flatter. So yeah, and here I'll probably just fix up even the top of the building a little bit more. As you can see, it's a little bit off perspective, just a little bit. So I'm just gonna clean it up. And also in terms of lighting, so this is one of the ways that you can also address the lighting too, is that there's nothing that's actually shining on the underside of the building. Because most of the light sources, as you've already done, they're kind of pointing down, but there's nothing that's actually indicating that there's any light that's hitting on the undersides. So this is where I probably really darken the underside of things. And even with the light here as well, I might even tinge the ground a little bit more red. Especially if it's like a wet and rainy day, which you seem to indicate with the umbrella. When a surface is a lot wetter, it tends to almost act like a more reflective surface too. So you can even add in a little bit of the sky color reflecting on the ground as well. I think that could be quite cool. And even with the lighting here as well, if you're trying to make it look like a little bit more of a spotlight, there's going to be areas that are also not lit by the spotlight here too. Because the spotlight is only radiating towards this direction, right? So there's some areas that's going to be darker as well. So you want to maybe darken around these areas as well. Just be very conscious about where light is hitting and where it's not hitting as well. So here there's no light source hitting, so I maybe would darken that as well. And one last thing that I'd like to try out, I realized that I think the car still looks a bit wonky, and that's my bad. So I want to try fixing it in perspective a lot more clearly. I feel like I've actually set the vanishing point a little bit too narrow. So if I am going to reverse engineer this building, let's just say if it is a bit more triangular. Yeah, I don't think it'll be as drastic, so that's my bad. So if this is a flat building and it swings out a bit more. Yeah, I don't think it'll be as dramatic. So I think even this path wouldn't converge that fast. So maybe it'll be a bit more. Yeah, probably be a bit more like that then. So yeah, my bad. And I think it won't be that drastic. It'll probably be something a little bit more like this. I think that feels a lot more comfortable. So just gonna make sure that I do it properly this time. Because there's no indication that this building swings out that wide, considering that the doors and all of the elements inside don't necessarily flare out too much. So that's my bad. And hey Gav, great to see you, man. How are you doing? Good to have you join in. Just giving a little bit of feedback as well actually today. Doing a special feedback stream today. Maybe if we get one on hard surface, it'll be cool to have you drop by and share your expertise as well, Gav. But yeah, I would say something like this. Synner, so I'll just flick the layers on and off. And also, and hello Quentin, great to see you. How are you guys? So in case you guys didn't know, both Gavin and Pandora or Quentin here in the chat are both my co-workers. So it's very sweet of them to drop by. And be sure to check out their works as well, guys. So I'll be dropping a link to their works in the chat as well. And be sure to check it out. They're both really awesome artists. That's Quentin And this is Gav's artwork. I gotta keep an eye out on me. Yeah, make sure that I'm not up to no good. But yeah, something like this. So before and after. So it's not too much of a change because I really do think you've done quite a solid job already, Synner. And if you're working digitally, one of the things that I personally like to do as a finishing touch is just add a bit of a screen layer for where like there's illumination. So especially with like super bright light sources too. It just makes things feel a little bit more, you know, that there's atmosphere and that things feel like they're actually illuminating. Maybe a little bit of red light here as well, since everything has been red anyways. So something like that, I think. So this is for Synner, paint over. So let's flip it on and off. Before and after. Before, after. So it's not too drastic, but I think it definitely addresses a lot of the crucial perspective issues. Maybe even add a bit of a ground as well. I don't know. Yeah, there we go. Just to make it feel like it's less floaty. Alright, so I'll just be linking this into the Discord as well. So I believe you redeemed for a and Hardik says, so the brief was to make a training room for a samurai. Anything else I should know? Like what kind of samurai he is? What kind of what are you trying to communicate with the piece? And if there's like any special considerations, maybe like, oh, it's a world that it's filled with magic samurais, wizard samurais. Because all of these things matter. But if it's just literally with the training room for a samurai, then, you know, I feel like it's quite general and broad. And Hardik says, so I tried to make it look like a dojo and add some basic storytelling and signs of life. Okay, cool. So it does seem to be more of a basic thing. Alright, so let's just work with that then. Alright, so first of all, I think it's quite solid, you know. It looks like you worked over a 3D base, I believe. And as a result, I think the fundamentals look pretty solid. However, since we are mostly here to address feedback on design and storytelling and all that kind of stuff, that's what we'll be focusing on. So I actually think that in terms of design, it's quite bland and generic. And what I mean by that is that it communicates as a training room of such for samurai, but if you're putting this out as a portfolio, I really do think that there needs to be a lot more design thinking put behind it. Yeah. Alright, we shall get back to feedback, so I'm gonna restretch the timer. Alright, gangs. So, Hardik, one of the first things when I look at a design is that I really try to think about, alright, what's the hook, you know? And what I mean by that is what makes this design unique? So in my opinion, I feel like, or maybe even like how well does this design communicate the function or tells the story. So to me, I don't get much of a sense of who's actually living here. I get that it's a samurai from all the samurai gear, but I'm not sure exactly what kind of training he's going through. First of all, the space here is quite cramped, so as a result, I'm not sure if he'd really be able to wield some of these long weapons. And even with all these bamboo here, for example, I've seen some demonstration of samurai actually cutting things down, and they seem to have a little bit more of a thick bamboo mat that they kind of really roll up and they chop and slice, whereas this is super thin. And I feel like as a result, it just doesn't seem like any specialized or specific equipment that's been created for training. And with all of these things as well, like there's target practice for the archer, but will the samurai actually really get so much out of doing it at such a close range? And in fact, it's kind of strange to see some of the arrows even being embedded in some of the sacks here down at the bottom. That would pretty much mean that he intentionally impaled those sacks, or he has really terrible aim. So even these kinds of details, you have to think about how did it get to that state in the first place, you know, and put yourself in the scene, you know, really think about how would I actually interact with it. Think about process or history of how things got to the current state. Is it practical even? And I feel like this space doesn't really feel like that. It actually just feels more like a weapon storage room. If you told me it's that, I'd believe it much more than a training room. And also with the other equipment, when you're putting things in the scene, you have to think about, is it really helping me with my design? Like all of these things that you're putting in, is it actually serving to bolster your story, or is it taking away from it? In my opinion, this kind of takes away from it because it doesn't share much about or contribute much to the overall brief of a training room. So these are the initial things that I'm looking at. And even here, like, is there a sword that or katana that's impaled into the armor? But this looks more like a shrine. Like, why would the shrine actually be impaled? Did someone break into the place? Maybe. It looks like it. Maybe with the door that's broken down. But then at the same time, the door doesn't really look like it's been kicked down. It's just kind of fallen off. It almost looks like it's there because it's in a state of disrepair rather than it being stormed. And there's no sign of a struggle anywhere else too. It just seems like this guy kicked the door down, if he even did, and he just impaled a katana in there and left. So all of these things need to be considered. So then it leads to a bigger question. How would we then improve it? Because I don't want to just, rip into the piece without actually offering up any solutions. So first of all, one of the things I'd do here, I'd maybe open up this area. I don't think that this area really seems too necessary. It doesn't add too much to the piece. And if we're going to go back to shape design as well, look at what's happening here, gang. This ground is similar size to this, and it's evenly divided. So not only does shape design only apply to general proportions, but it also can come to like how you divide up the room. You'll notice that here, there's even the same width here as well. And then this width is also the same to this. So when you're creating a space, try and think about this. This is why I'm such a huge advocate of floor plans. When I'm doing a top-down view of the place, I want it to be divided asymmetrically. So for example, the pit in the middle, maybe it's this big, and then maybe the area or that small ledge or balcony would maybe be more like this, So there's a lot more different lengths between all of it. There's none that are really sharing. And when you have unique proportions for each area, it's much easier to give it a specialization within that area too. And you can also create focal points as well. So because every shape is different, because this area is so big, you might think that's of big importance. So that's why you can put all the training equipment here. So going back to the paint over, I'm just going to do something like this. I'm going to open this pit up. I'm not going to worry about lighting actually, although that's another thing that could be talked about. So I'm going to open this pit up. And with the equipment as well, I'm going to maybe think about, for example, samurai bamboo dummy. So this is where proper research also comes in handy as well, guys. I think it really shows when, you know, we make up some of the details, and you can tell the difference between someone that has really put in the time to do this extra research. And don't get me wrong, it can be so easy as well, guys, to, you know, neglect it. Because I'm the same as well. I really want to just jump into a piece. So this is what it will probably look like, you know. And as you can see, it looks so much more interesting and much more designed than a normal, than the bamboo sticks as it is. So maybe you can have a few of them here, and maybe you can have difference between them in terms of like the condition. Maybe because it's the samurai didn't clean up after himself after the training, you see some of it on the floor right here. So now we can see it in different states. We see it in a state of wholeness, where we see that it hasn't been sliced up, and a state that it's been actually cut down by the samurai. And this is where you can really vary up your detail. You can actually show the function of something without necessarily having to do a flow chart saying that, oh, this is what you do with it, this is how it look like after. You can just simply have two different objects, or as many as you need within logic, and you just let the viewer fill in the gaps that, oh, okay, this is this item in its pristine state, and then this is that item in its interacted state. And exactly, that's exactly it as well, Cactus. Because a lot of the things are lying around, it shows that he's an untidy samurai. So if we really want to emphasize that, maybe we can do it even more, where we're offsetting a lot more things. The scrolls are untidy and things like that. So we can use that to our advantage. And that's something very much worth thinking about. So this is where it comes in. Does the design actually tell that story? So first of all, I'll open up the space. And maybe for this, I wouldn't even put it here, honestly. It just seems weird that all of a sudden there's like, you know, what do you call it? That there's like a wooden stick just sticking out. He's running late to practice with toast in his mouth every morning. Amazing. But yeah, even with this cutaway, maybe it's something more like this. And maybe the bow and arrow training, you know, it can be somewhere else. You don't have to necessarily cram everything here. Maybe you actually have like a grass field outside here that he does more of the training at. You don't have to force the details into the scene pretty much. And then on top of that as well, you can start thinking about what other details you can do to maybe like in the sand you have like footprints, you know, or like maybe showing where he's tread and things like that. So this is more like subtle storytelling that you can put in. Not everything has to be super pristine, for example. And with this dummy, you can move it all the way down here as well, for example. So rather than it blocking the door for whatever reason, you can always bring it down there instead. And I'd remove this. I don't think it's necessary. And you clean things up where it doesn't need to be there. So yeah, I mean, if you want to keep the details as it is, I think it's fine though with the rest. Yeah, it's probably something like that then. I think this is like the most major feedback I would address first with the piece. So hopefully that helps, Hardik, and that gives you something to think about as well. And Synner says the lamp has been bugging me. Looks like a water pump. Yeah, I mean, well, I guess that's a little bit more to do with like subtle design, but with the bigger picture, I think that's what I'm personally much more concerned about. So after addressing that, then I think we can really focus on the smaller details, you know, like for example, maybe you can have, if you have guns here, maybe like there's gunpowder. I don't know how it works. Maybe a bow restringing station and things like that. So really think about all of those things later on, but work from the bigger picture first. The smaller details can definitely come in later. Awesome. I'm glad to hear that that helped, Hardik. So I'm just gonna save this as a JPEG for you too. And we can tick this one off and move on to the next one, gang. So hopefully we can get through at least one more. And Yari asked, talking about research, how would you go about deciding how much time you spend researching? Because we can keep researching forever. I think depends how much time you have, but I would generally spend, let's just say, you know, roughly speaking, if I had 100% of my time to spend, I would spend maybe 20% even doing the research. And I know that's very vague, but let's just say I had 5 days, you know, I'd spend maybe even one whole day doing research if it is a piece that demands a lot of research and design thinking. So that's just a rough guideline, but it's a very personal thing. I know some people that just dive into it, you know, but I like to do my research personally, and I think that's what makes the difference between, you know, a good piece and a great piece. And Yari says, I just love the research so much that I tend to overdo it and still keep coming back to it during designing. That's the thing. That's not something that should be seen as a bad thing. Design is a highly organic process, highly iterative, and you should never feel like it's a bad thing if you're going back to researching. Because you might not even be able to preemptively realize what kind of references that you need. And I often go back, especially with different stages. Maybe at the start I'm focusing on design ref, but near the end I'm purely focusing on maybe color ref, for example. But rarely I find that you can have too much reference, because in the end, even if you do, it's better that you have too much than too little, in my opinion. And even as a project goes on, you'll even find out that there's some references that are much more useful to you, which you probably keep, and some that aren't, which you can probably delete. So it's fine. Yeah, I think this one's nicely done, Pierre. I do like the mood that you set out. The colors look really good too. And the design as well. I think there's some really interesting designs working over here too. Alright, so paint over in JPEG. Fantastic. Yeah, the segmented tree branches are cool. It's very interesting. Whale has been drained. And Pierre says, so I would like to have feedback on the composition. And overall, I feel like the quality of the piece isn't good. I don't know how to say it. I feel like it's less sharp than what I see on ArtStation. So I'll do my best to address the second part of the feedback, but I feel like the first one is something that I could give better feedback on. Because generally, and admittedly, pushing the level of finish is not something that I typically focus on in my own art too. But I can focus on composition. That's something that I'm much more experienced in. Alright, so similar to all of the other pieces, you'll notice a common thread here. So when we're talking about composition, what does that actually mean? What makes a good composition? And to me, it still comes down to this concept, breaking evens or breaking evenness. So it's the idea that you don't want to repeat same size shapes on canvas. Is a big no. You don't want that in your piece. So what do I mean by that? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the terms graphic shapes and graphic reads. It's something that's so commonly repeated by a lot of people. It's like, oh, such juicy graphic shapes that you have there, or like, oh, such juicy shape designs there. So what do people really mean by that? And to me, it's as simple as how much space does the shape take on the canvas when it is converted to a simpler version of itself, just a pure silhouette. So the way that I'm looking at this piece is this. I'm viewing this as one big shape. I'm viewing this as another shape. So there's lots of small shapes. This is one bigger shape over here. And what I'm more interested in, rather than its relative size of the element, is actually the space that is taking up on the canvas. So first of all, I'll just draw out a few more shapes and I'll show what I think can immediately be done to improve the piece, and why I personally think right now the composition is feeling quite flat and can be a lot more dynamic. So first of all, I do think that you've done a good job in terms of providing areas of rest. So let's go with the positives first. All of the areas of detail are pretty much here. And as a result, I think it works quite well. I do think that the way that the eye is led through the piece works really well. However, I think the big thing about this piece is that a lot of the graphic shapes feel same-ish on the canvas. So this is what I see. This is similar to this in terms of thickness. This is similar to that too. This is somewhat similar. And the branch as well is somewhat similar in terms of width with the pillars in the foreground. And then also as well with this, the bench, the character, with that. And in terms of other shapes as well, this is what I'm seeing. This thickness is similar to this. This is similar to that. This is similar to this. This you can, yeah, and even like that, if you want to cut it in this way, this might be a little bit more nitpicky, but it cuts the same way. And as a result, the whole piece just flattens itself out very quickly. Because how can I tell when something is in the foreground or not, when some of the elements in the background is very similar to the size of the elements in the foreground? So I'm going to do something quite drastic here. First of all, I'm just going to separate out the foreground. So let's see if this works out. But don't worry, Pierre, it's something that's easily missed. I did not realize that that was one way you can view composition, because I think a lot of us tend to really think about, once again, like, well, I'm just putting in medium shapes, big shapes, large shapes. I think you did a good job with that. You have a lot of small shapes here, which is great. However, the issue is that you have a similar distribution of medium shapes in the background or the midground, the focal point, similar to the foreground. What you want to do is strategically put the large shapes in one area, the medium shapes and smaller shapes in another. So this is what I'm trying to achieve in essence. Here's a very simplified and cartoonish way of viewing the scene. Or like one possible solution. What if you have a large shape, then you have like a medium shape here, and then you have small. This is a very highly exaggerated version. And then I'm gonna introduce a few medium shapes as well. So for example, and then maybe like, yeah, a few smaller shapes here as well. So this is extremely exaggerated, but you'll see a large, medium, maybe I'll add in a couple more too. Medium, small, 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 small. So notice what happens once I do this. What if I decided to, oh, this is like a cobblestone path that I want in the foreground. Watch what happens once I start dividing the foreground in similar size to the element here. Everything washes out all of a sudden. Or that might seem like a very comical and very like unrealistic thing to happen. But what if I suddenly added bushes here? That's a very typical thing we do in our foreground, right? But what if we add bushes that are similar size to the clouds? Notice what's happening. The scene is flattening itself out very, very quickly. And on top of that, what if I now add in some of the same square sizes from the foreground and from the background into the foreground? The scene just loses that dynamism instantly. So that's what we're going to try and do with your piece, is we're going to try to really design these shapes properly so we achieve that sense of dynamism back in the piece. But something to keep in mind with this as well, guys, is that you can't have it completely perfect. You're gonna have some overlap somewhere. But the idea is that you don't want the majority of the shapes to be the same. You can have some, but not most of it. Let me group this together. So first of all, let me try doing this. I'll make this a lot bigger. That's one thing. And I think I might actually remove the small circle, the small plants on the side over there. Yeah, the tree is really cool. For sure. So we'll do our best to keep that. So another thing that I like to do is create this. A feeling of things going into the background. And I like using triangles. So this is what I'm thinking. The tree could be triangular. And the branches will almost go like this. So it gets smaller and smaller. So rather than having everything the same length throughout, I want to try to make it converge towards the focal point. Oops, sorry guys. I selected it incorrectly. So let's just work with the foreground elements first. Let me actually move this to the side too. So this one might require some manual overpainting though. Let me do this then. So I'm trying to avoid the same size. Look at what's happening here before. If I was doing it around here, this is what I'm seeing. This is similar to this. I don't want that. I really don't. So I'm gonna make it much bigger so that we create a much clearer distinction. And I'll probably have to move the character as well. So when you're fixing compositions like this, you'll probably notice a bit of a domino effect happening. So it's definitely quite a bit of a change. So I have all the smaller shapes here, kind of doing that. Not forgetting even the negative shapes as well. That matters too, by the way. The negative shapes are a graphic shape you should consider in your composition too. But so far, thankfully, we don't have too many shapes of that similar size. Alright, thanks all for joining, Yari. I'll see you around, man. Take care. So with this, I'd probably remove it as well. I don't think this is too necessary. We can leave it to the branches to have that whole thing of like pointing of like, hey, look here, you know. The plants here as well, I think can work. I think we can definitely leave it in. Maybe a few elements here as well. Maybe a much larger one. Let me do this. So just by working on the foreground, you'll notice that the composition suddenly feels a lot more dynamic, you know. So before, even just at this stage, before and after. But next, what I'm gonna do is shift this over, because as a consequence of moving that, it's gonna need and I want to make it bigger, you know. I think this, because it's the focal point, it definitely demands a whole lot more attention. And why not blast it with a lot more smaller shapes? Like make it crazy, you know, with the silhouette. Much crazier. And maybe on top of that as well, you can add in an accent color if you'd like. Because you have a lot of yellows and blues, maybe the accent color can be a little bit more towards the red, you know, desaturated. Maybe there's like banners hanging, for example. You can use a color accent for that. And I'd still remove this, personally. I don't think it's serving it much. It's once again the same size as some of these rock formations, so I think it's not. Or, you know what, I think you have a lot of intent behind it with the runes, so I wouldn't remove it. So maybe what I'd end up doing is consider making it you know, it might be fine. You know what, I think it might be fine. But instead of that, I'm gonna introduce smaller shapes as well. So once again, it's graphic shapes, right? Rather than having a singular isolated, why don't I actually change the silhouette? So it's like, alright, it's a lot more unique now. So now it's like seen as a small cluster, you know. This is still seen as one big shape though. Don't forget, it's the graphic shape on the read if you just group everything together. And why not add a little bit of a dip? Because once again, contrast is all about making things different, right? Rather than having this on top, why don't you add a little bit of a dip here, you know? So it's like, rather than having everything straight, you can have a small dip here where these guys will be. That will already help them to stand out. I'll clarify the silhouette more too. And I maybe even make this a whole lot slimmer too. Let me try. No, maybe not. I think it kind of works okay. Nah, I think that was fine. But I'd also make this bigger because it's still the same similar-ish size here. So I'm gonna make this a lot more dramatic too. Clarify the silhouette. Don't forget negative shapes counts as graphic shapes too, gang. So I want to make it really stand out. Add smaller shapes here too. And look at this as well. This is similar in size. It slices the scene, so don't. I would suggest remove it. Create it open. And instead put it here, the trinkets here. Keep it open, keep the path open. And you're also introducing a triangular shape now. Notice that this was squarish, but now that you add the strings like that, it becomes a triangular shape. Notice that in your scene, most of it seems to be quite round. Maybe you can say this is triangular. But most of your scene is round, maybe a bit squarish. But the moment you add a triangle, it creates like, first of all, flow towards the focal point. But also you're specially reserving the triangular shapes for the focal point. And because it's so different, once again, contrast is about novelty and difference, right? Because it's different, now it suddenly stands out. I'm gonna now remove that. That doesn't help the scene much. And why not even exaggerate some of these a little bit more? Those are cool small details. Add more of that. Oh, I like the repetition of shapes here. It's always worked. Maybe a bit more string. Blast your focal point with details. And maybe just break it up here as well. So what I'm seeing here, that there's a lot of negative space here. So why not just maybe try? I'll try. It might not work, but maybe I'll just break it up a bit. Maybe trying to echo that giant monolith in the back. Maybe. Nah. No, you know what? Let's keep it simple. I'm wrong about that one. So I'm just experimenting. I think the simplicity helps because it makes the focal point stand out a lot more. So I'm wrong when it came to that one. And with the path as well, I'm gonna make it more triangular. I'm gonna make it go like that. So it's converging. It gives it a sense of perspective. And bigger shapes going to smaller ones. Bigger shapes going to even smaller ones. Alright. If you want to bring back some of those things, you can. Maybe make it a lot bigger here too, so that we don't share some of the things in the foreground. Just to break it up here. But yeah, I think that's just about it for the feedback here. Hopefully that helped. And maybe here you can add a bit of fog here as well too. Let me get my brushes right. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Just add some atmosphere to make it extra moody as well. Some fog rolling across. Yeah. Atmospheric separation and whatnot. Awesome, glad to hear it helped. So what I'm gonna do is first of all just arrange the notes neatly, and I'll send over the JPEG. Yeah, no worries. There's definitely different solutions. In the end, it's just that whatever you do, just make sure that it doesn't share too much of the same size. That's all. That could mean making the tree much smaller. And thank you for sub, Synner. Really appreciate it. So Hiro says, want some feedback on presentation and things I can do better for next time. Things that I should and spend a longer time on for next piece. Just pitfalls that you see in the piece that is holding it back. Example, better prop rendering, scale issues with beams in general, camera angles. Mostly want to level up my next building design. Alright, cool. So it's quite broad, I suppose, but I'll look at what really stands out to me. And Hiro says, mostly want to focus on first page, but if you can give some feedback on a third page presentation, that would help out a lot. Alright, let's see what we can get through. But for this piece, so one thing, before we start, I think it'll be good to at least even address what's been done well here. I do think that, the rendering of the piece is done really nicely. The overall design, the vibe of the place is great. I think it's one of your best pieces yet, Hiro. So I think you should be proud of this piece, man. And I think you definitely put in a lot more thought with the storytelling. I really appreciate all those small details you put in. And I think those are the kinds of things I really appreciate. And I really do think if people spend the time to look at, will also learn to appreciate as well too. Especially when you have like art directors looking at it. I'm sure that they will notice these things as well. And Cactus says, my favorite detail is the Triforce symbol that looks like Link climbed up and carved in the chimney. Ah, right. Yeah. I didn't notice that. But see, there you go. You're getting rewarded for spending more time looking at the piece. So, first of all, I think one of the big issues that I'm seeing is literally something quite big in size. And that is the scale. So, you've already mentioned this, Hiro, but I think it's the size of the beams. And judging from the size of like the steps and everything, I think human would be around this scale. However, some of the things just feel crazy thick, You have to have like one giant chunk of tree to be able to do something like that. So first of all, I would really just address this thickness of certain things. They're way too thick, and unless you're going for a heavily stylized environment, that's something I would avoid. And so I'll address that first. I do think the extra support here is nice, but however, there's already a contrast between the design language. This feels like it's a prop up for the chimney, whereas this feels like it's integrated. And you have a lot of elements that are integrated. So I feel like, what's the point of propping up the chimney unless the chimney is going to collapse? So if you really want to do that, do something like this, where it matches the design language a little bit more and it feels more integrated. You can create a negative space as well. That won't be an issue. But for example, something like that. I think that would feel more integrated than what it was before. You want to try reducing the amount of design language that you have. Like for example, you have this unique shape. As we've covered in previous pieces, uniqueness and contrast are great things. However, think about where you're putting it. Where is your focal point? Where do you really want things to be unique? And in my opinion, the fact, like, why would there really be a reason to vary up the construction methods for each of these places unless there was an extremely good reason for it, like a special purpose for it? Let's just say, for example, this area is meant to have like a giant cuckoo clock, that comes out, and the toys come out and all of that. Then maybe it'll be built differently, and that will justify your reason to have a different construction method. But in this case, it doesn't. So I would suggest making that consistent. So think about it. So I think, for example, this one might be a good one. This one's a bit, actually, let's just say we just go for this one, just because it has most detail. First of all, I'll scale this up. And the name of the game, this stream, or for most of the things that I'm giving feedback on, is that we want to avoid evenness. However, if I turn these off, guess what's happening here? Boom, boom, more or less even. And if this is a sign, I'd really want to make that read a lot clearer. However, there's a shield behind it too, so it's getting a bit confusing. This is also quite unique, so I feel like there's so much points of contrast and even another window here for whatever reason. So you have to think about even the construction of the house. Why would there be a window here? And in fact, why would there be a different type of window construction to everything else in the house? Generally, you want to keep things the same, and most builders, I think, would want to do that as well. So my solution here is to kind of just remove that. I don't think it's necessary. Make it nice and big. Bold statement. Make the sign much bigger too. But it's a bit of a boring sign, so I mean, unless it serves a specific purpose, I would try and spruce it up a bit with the design language. Because everything has been so custom made that I think it'll be nice to have it there too. So once again, consistency in window design. The rest are a little bit more consistent, but you gotta decide if you want to have this trellis style window or you want like a normal window. So keep it consistent. And as you can see, just by doing that, I'm making creating some areas of rest. Everything is so similar otherwise. So here, maybe try and repeat the same thing here as well. But of course, you have to think about the scale. Maybe the window won't be there too. Be something more like that perhaps. Then having a cross beam there. Wait a minute, Cactus. I just remembered something. Aren't you supposed to be on holiday, by the way? I saw on your Instagram that you were like at the airport and whatnot. Just remembered actually. Unless you're watching during the holiday. And might I say, that's a very wise way to spend your holiday. Is to watch my streams, of course. Ooh. Are they watching as well too? Hopefully I have, I've been giving a good impression so far, if they are. That's quite the experience, I would say, watching this stream in HD. Oh no! Hello, Mrs. Crystal. As you can see, I've been having a very good influence on your daughter. I'm helping her with her art and everything, even promoting good health and everything. So hopefully you're enjoying the stream. But yeah, so not to get too distracted from feedback, keeping the shadows consistent as well, design language as well. I try and keep it more consistent here too. And don't be afraid to just simplify some areas as well. And for me, I wouldn't necessarily put that extra bit of embellishment there. And the reason is that it feels like it's not the focal point, you know. I actually think that the front entrance could benefit from it much more. Cactus's mom says, "Hi gang." Oh, that's so awesome. We got a shout out from Cactus's mom, guys. Mom lounge. But yeah, Hiro, if you want to do something like that, put it over here. But once again, keep things a bit more consistent where you can. But even then, that still feels a little bit much, you know? Maybe your mom can just adopt the whole gang, Cactus. It seems like everyone's calling her mom already. And also here, I personally would even keep it simple. And don't forget the height as well. What I'm seeing here, Hiro, is that this is just a little bit similar to this segment. So I personally would even make the chimney much smaller. But then again, I know it's a little bit too similar now to the one at the bottom. Probably make it something more like that, maybe. So maybe more like that. We're all one stretchy family now. But yeah, I'd probably make it a bit smaller as well. This one's probably a little bit tricky to adjust the proportions. But make it smaller. And also design language consistency. I feel like generally roofs as well, they would have a little bit more construction to it. Just maybe add a few more slats. But you know, if you're using the same roof building method, why not apply the same here as well? I feel like that's probably one of the big things for you to work on, Hiro, is just really trying to reserve uniqueness of design language for special areas rather than making every single part different. I think that's what this piece, what really stands out to me in this piece. And of course, just lighting consistency as well. It'll be good to get a little bit of, you know, brightness. And here, I don't think this banner is really needed too. I'd personally rather get something like that. Because when there's too much banner, it starts feeling like a palace of sorts. So you have to think about what your detail elements are actually communicating in terms of the design. And it doesn't feel as much of a home anymore. So yeah, that's the main thing that I would say. So before and after. Look, with the chimney, I think the tall chimney has its own charm, so maybe we could keep that. But in any case, this is the paint over. It's just making the design language a lot more consistent overall. And of course, I took my own liberties in terms of what I would consider the consistent element. But if you're reworking this piece, you're definitely more than welcome to decide that for yourself. And don't be afraid to add in areas of rest too. So yeah, just because everything's so detail dense, I personally would like to see less banners and just something like that. No. In the shadows, that's typically where you want the rest area too. So something like that. Maybe a bit more construction here. Yeah. and maybe making, can always make one of the trees a bit bigger too, and even in the back, just so it feels. But that's just a small personal preference. And Hiro says, scale shoes, design consistency, and breaking evens. You really need to nail it into my silly little brain next time. Yeah, it can be a bit tricky, but I think once you guys watch enough of these kinds of feedback streams where I'm talking about, it's like breaking evens, things like that, then I think you guys will start to internalize that as well. And Hiro or Hardik says, Jordan, are you ever going to start doing mentorships again? I will, but not in the meantime, just because my schedule is quite full and I'd rather not overwhelm myself, but it's something that I really do want to do. And this is something that I do cover in my mentorship as well, guys. So just to, so if you guys are enjoying or have enjoyed this feedback stream, just imagine what a full mentorship would be like. I'll be showing you guys all of the insights into how I think about our design and how I think about design language, and even some exercises on how to practice that as well. So Hiro can tell you all about that too. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like feedback done on your very own piece, then be sure to head on over to my Twitch and give me a follow, where I do feedback sessions like this every week.